Let me introduce Thomas Boleke, Senior Fellow for Global Health, Economics and Development of the Council for Foreign Relations, and co-author Aaron Kesselheim, Associate Professor of Medicine, Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And I understand you're going to be sharing the presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Brookings for hosting this event. Tom and I are going to talk about high generic drug prices, and these are some pictures from recent news stories, including, that's Martin Shkreli there in the middle. That's now twice that we've said his name, and I think if you say it a third time, he appears on stage. So our goal today is to talk about the role of generic drugs in the U.S. market, some of the market failures that have occurred leading to high generic drug prices, available strategies to address these issues, and our proposal, as well as an empirical analysis applying our proposal to the current market to see how it would work. So just first, to set the stage a little bit about talking about the role of generic drugs. Generic drugs make up about 89% of dispensed medication in the United States, but only 27% of overall drug spending. It's very important to recognize that high drug prices in the United States mostly relate to high brand name drug prices. We are going to be talking about the corners of the market relating to high generic drug prices. But in general, generic drugs are the best value that the U.S. healthcare system has, and by one estimate has saved over $1 trillion over the past decade. And since the Waxman-Hatch Act of 1984, for which Congressman Waxman is here and will address later, we have seen that the percentage of overall generics making up a percentage of the amount of prescription in the U.S. Raised from about 19% to 89% today. There are some important unique aspects of the generic drug market. So generic drugs are small molecule drugs, are very inexpensive to manufacture, and can be sold close to the cost of development. And they are interchangeable at the pharmacy level, meaning that if a physician writes a prescription for a brand name drug, that in all 50 states, pharmacists have the power to automatically substitute that product. So there is no marketing for generic drugs. Generic drugs compete on price. And this price competition is the only kind of competition in the U.S. drug market that consistently and substantially leads to reduced prices. Competition between different branded products does not lead to reduced prices as substantially. But just because something is generic doesn't mean that it's cheap. Generics are cheap because of competition. And in fact, when you only have one generic drug for a brand name drug, prices only decline to about 55% of the brand name price. It's not until we get more like 4 or 5 or 6 drugs on the market, or even more, that you see prices as low as what we might expect. Another issue is that the supply and demand here is pretty inelastic, because it is more difficult to enter the generic drug market, because you have to do some tests to show that your drug is bioequivalent to the brand name product, and you have to go through the FDA approval process, which until recently was somewhat lengthy because of the lack of resources that had been dedicated to the review and staffing in the generic drug office, most resources at the FDA being focused on the single-minded need to get new drugs on the market. And so what we've seen is that makes the supply elastic, and the demand can be inelastic too, particularly if there are certain patients who have to take a certain product, a certain generic drug, and don't have the ability to take other versions that might be available as well. So what we've seen in the last few years is some price hikes on generic drugs. One review of over 20,000 products showed that 2% of them increased over 1,000%. The really good news is that most generic drugs in most circumstances are still very inexpensive, but there are these corners of the market where generic drugs have become quite expensive. And here on the screen, you can see a few examples of some older generic products where you've seen massive increases in prices over the last few years. There are many reasons why this occurs, and I just want to focus on 2 of them to sort of set the stage for Tom's discussion of our proposal. So first is that we see examples of companies exploiting natural monopolies in niche markets. So in some cases, generic drugs, older products, are used by so few people that there aren't enough manufacturers drawn to manufacture the product. And this is an example that we published in the New England Journal a few years ago, looking at the prices of albendazole, an antiparasitic agent used mostly in immigrants and refugees, not a very common product, was sold at very low cost by GlaxoSmithKline until a pharmaceutical entrepreneurial outfit bought it and raised the price because it had never attracted other generic competitors, even though it had lost its patent. And it wasn't, and thus, after that, even though it was being sold for a very small amount, after the purchase, the price went sky high. It went even higher after the only other competitor in the market, mebendazole, was withdrawn by its manufacturer for economic, business-related reasons. And then there were truly no other potential alternatives, and the price jumped even higher. So this kind of market activity is the kind that we're seeking to address with our proposal. Another reason why generic drugs might increase in price is because of consolidations and mergers. So in one case of the drug digoxin, there used to be 8 manufacturers, and due to various consolidations, mergers, exits from the market, it reduced down to 2 or 3, and the price went up. One of the major drivers of these kinds of exits from the market are shortages of some of the products that went into the manufacture of the generic drugs. Shortages of the products lead manufacturers to exit the market, and then it again is a little bit harder to get back into the market after the shortage is resolved. And this is a graph again showing that shortages of older generic drugs is a really important issue. And where I work at Brigham and Women's Hospital, we get reports all the time from our pharmacy about older products that all of a sudden aren't available any further. Even products as silly as salt water, which you would think that a country as powerful as ours should be able to maintain a supply of. This was a study that we did that's going to be coming out in Annals of Internal Medicine that shows the association between consolidation within a generic drug market and the increases in prices. And you can see that based on the amount of consolidation in the market as measured by the HHI Hirschman-Herfindahl Index, that the manufacturers that are remaining are able to increase their prices in a direct way based on the amount of market power they have. If you look at the price changes for these generic drugs over the last 5 years, stratified based on the amount of consolidation within the marketplace itself. Okay, so there have been a number of strategies that have been attempted to try to solve this issue. The first was the Generic Drug User Fee Act in 2012, which increased the amount of funding for the FDA. And currently, the delays at the FDA for getting new generic drugs on the market is much improved over what it was a few years ago. Other people have suggested waiving the user fees for priority generic drugs that the Generic Drug User Fee Act implies. Another proposal that the FDA has enacted is they've decided to start accelerating the review of generic drugs for sole source products, so for products that have no generics on the market. There have been other alternatives suggested, including the accelerating the review further for maybe up to generic drugs that don't have more than 2 or 3 other manufacturers on the market. Other suggestions include the government getting in as a purchaser and offering long-term contracts for niche products to try to stabilize the market, the creation of nonprofit generic drug manufacturers to try to address this issue, waiving the Medicare non-interference provision that doesn't allow Medicare to negotiate the price of drugs for multi-source products, and the suggestion that we temporarily import products from overseas. The FDA actually already does this. In the case of shortages, it allows drugs to be imported from overseas. And that is the idea that we are basing our idea on. So, come.
Fantastic. Okay. We're just switching slides. You may think of this as a relay race where Aaron has handed me the baton. I like to think of it more as the Pony Express, where this is where the presentation really gallops forward and delivers the information that you need. We all set? Yeah. Fantastic.
30 seconds for that.
Yes, what do I do?
Where would you start?
Oh, right after Aaron. Include goals. Great. So let me tell you about what we intend with this proposal. And the first is that, of course, we want to propose something that's sustainably addresses U.S. Generic drug costs, and improves patients' access to safe and effective medicines. We'd like it to be a proposal that is able to attract bipartisan support. There's not very much these days that can do that, but we'd like to think the idea that we put forward here might. The third is, I don't know if our proposal is a Buck Rogers solution, but we'd look for something that is feasible, that doesn't require significant new legislative mandate to achieve or new institutions to run. The last is we don't want to propose something around importation that undercuts the essential role of the FDA in assuring quality, safety, and efficacy of medicines used in the United States. And this is what we came up with. The first is, and I don't have to spend a lot of time on this, is that it's very important that we pass the Generic Drug User Fee Act reauthorization. There's no version of ensuring adequate competition and supply on the market without a strong Office of Generic Drugs at the FDA. So that's important. The parts I'm going to spend my time on in this talk are the single window. We propose a single window where you'd have a common application for seeking abbreviated new drug approvals in multiple countries. And the second is the possibility of creating a reciprocal drug approval pathway. The single window would be a common electronic application to apply simultaneously to the U.S. and other designated stringent national regulatory authorities. We would propose initially limiting that to Canada and the European Union, but expanding it over time to a other short list of stringent national regulatory authorities. The good news is that this would be voluntary, wouldn't remove FDA from the process. It's still approving, still has the decision to approve the application or not, and it builds on existing precedents and infrastructure. The U.S. and Canada have recently concluded an agreement to have a common electronic submissions gateway project in which you can have submissions go to both agencies. Canada is already receiving 86% of its applications this way, and this has happened in just under a year. The U.S. will implement this. Thank you. The U.S. will implement this soon. There's also, in the European Union, there's the centralized procedure that creates a single pathway. It still has national regulatory authorities underneath that. It didn't result in harmonization or the elimination of those agencies, but has been seen as quite successful. Our second proposal is, or I guess our third proposal is reciprocal drug approval. So this is approval based of generic versions of drugs already on the U.S. market that have been approved in other stringent national regulatory authorities. Again, here in this system, we propose that the FDA would still have the ultimate decision, and you may even be able to carve out pieces of it where the discretion would remain with the FDA to address local factors like labeling. Again, we would limit this to drugs with inadequate generic competition, which we define as fewer than 4 generic competitors on the market. We would initially exclude complex generics from this pathway. Again, here too, you can limit it to a set of countries like the European Union and Canada. We lay out in our paper a procedure of how these types of equivalence arrangements have been negotiated and the types of executive agreements that underlie them using the International Civil Aviation Organization model. Again, here too, existing precedent and infrastructure. There's currently an international generic drug regulators pilot that's being run by the World Health Organization, but the U.S. Participates in that's pushing for convergence of these standards. Again, there are multiple precedents. The European Union has a decentralized procedure where one national regulatory authority can grant approval and other national regulatory authorities have a procedure. Again, it rests ultimately with those other national regulatory authorities to grant reciprocal approval. Mexico has a similar system. Could this make a difference? So we did an analysis to assess whether or not it might. And I'm going to draw, this is a complicated table, I'm just going to draw 2 conclusions from it. What it is we looked at the novel therapeutics that have been approved since the Watchman-Hacks Act, October 1984, to January 2016. We looked at only tablets and capsules, so that's set. And which of these drugs are eligible for generic competition but have insufficient generic competition? You find 69 of them. Of those, we then assessed looking at other stringent national regulatory authorities, first EU and Canada, but then looking at other ones that made the proposal in the Results Act as stringent national regulatory authorities. Which ones of these drugs are being approved by a different manufacturer as the sponsor in another stringent national regulatory authority? So you might be able to introduce international competition. You find 44 of them, so 2/3. Are available in other stringent national regulatory, or have been approved by other stringent national regulatory authorities. 23 of these, 1/3 of them, there's enough other different manufacturers that make it in that stringent national regulatory authority that you could reach what we set as a standard of adequate competition, so 4 generic versions. So that's a number in terms of 2/3. We have 44 drugs that might be able to benefit from this proposal. Is that significant? That's not a lot of drugs. How many patients does this represent? How large are the market? So we just looked at 2015 Medicare Part D spending for these drugs and saw how much was being spent on drugs with insufficient U.S. competition. And what you find, and again, I'm just going to draw 3 points out of this, is the median for U.S. generic drugs with insufficient competition, so these 69, is that it's $8.6 million spent median just by Medicare Part D. In 2015, a total of $2.4 billion. If you look at the drugs that would benefit or are available from different manufacturer, that goes to $1.9 billion. So $1.9 billion of that $2.4 billion could be potentially reduced by introducing international competition. And again, this just looks at Medicare Part D. So we draw from this that there's the possibility of sustainable price competition that might be spurred by our proposal. This is particularly true for drugs. You see the benefit really for drugs with no generic version currently, or only 1 generic version. If you just limited it to the EU and Canada, still useful. If you expand it to the other stringent regulatory agencies, obviously you get more benefit, but still useful for there. This strategy, again, just addresses a subset of the generic market, so it is by no means the only solution out there for U.S. generic drug prices. Just to quickly point out here, did we meet our standard of those 4 goals that we're going at? We think so, in that this is, by limiting it just to already approved generics, it doesn't have the same safety risks, it keeps the FDA in the process, it shouldn't require legislative changes to implement. The FDA, you may even get benefit for the FDA from complying with the recent executive order, the 2-for-1 on regulatory, reducing regulatory costs. And it's competition-based. So it's something that might be able to attract support from both sides of the aisle. The risk, just to briefly mention, is that, of course, generic drug prices tend to be higher in other markets, so they would have to price them competitively to compete in our market. Long-term consequences of doing this are hard to predict in terms of will you see more consolidation in the generic drug industry, and this places demands on FDA's international resources to negotiate these arrangements, and they would need to be properly funded to do it. Thank you.
Thank you both. Other questions? Someone standing in the back?
Thank you.
Lauren Hershey. I was a guest scholar here in 1986-87 on telecommunications policy, restructuring the AT&T. I really enjoyed hearing Hirschman-Herfindahl Index mentioned. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Kind of a process question, but a point of fact question also. What percentage of American adults, and what actual number would you know offhand, let's say over the age of 30, are using a prescription medication, just to sort of check out the constituency that's out there on these complex questions? Point number 2, and I want to thank Brookings very much for taking the lead on this. Do you predict sometime in the next year or 2, with all the political brouhaha on the pharmaceutical companies, for there to be oversight hearings and proposed new legislation? And if so, what might that be? And I know it's going to be addressed later in the day.
Yeah,
I'd like to hear
I
your
think that's
remarks.
beyond this paper. Why don't you answer the first one?
Okay. I can look that up. I mean, I think that that's an easily knowable number that I don't happen to have off the top of my head, about what the number, the percentage of U.S. People over age 30 who get at least one prescription in the last year. I don't know if I could, if I know that off the top of my head. Oh, but maybe somebody in the audience does. Let's crowdsource this. Did you just raise your hand?
Sure, no,
I'm trying to deflect attention.
A very high proportion.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go. This woman here.
Yes, couple of things that perhaps are even more
name, please.
basic. First of all, you and the predecessors kind of have an East Coast presence. So I'm wondering if you purchase something from a CVS or a Walmart in South Dakota, is the price of that generic the same in South Dakota and Arkansas? And second of all, sometimes people say that even if it's a generic, you should shop between two providers. So go to Giant and go to Walmart or whatever. So in terms of generic, I'm thinking about those horizontal and vertical comparisons, if that's within the scope. Thank you.
Sure. So I guess the two issues. So the price of a generic drug there are some variations, and there have been some studies that shown that there may be some slight variations between different chain pharmacies versus individual pharmacies, et cetera. But in general, the prices are generally pretty consistent across the country. And we're doing additional work to kind of look at this question more recently, because I think a lot of those studies are a little bit older. There's a really good website called GoodRx that you can go on, and you can plug in your generic drug, and you can look for all the pharmacies in your area and to see where the different cash prices are at the different pharmacies. And so there are efforts being made to try to address those kinds of issues.
Yeah.
Right. I think that in general, and again, in terms of like shopping so in general, most patients don't know which manufacturer is making their generic drug, and the great thing about the system that we have in place that was created by the Waxman-Hatch Act was that you don't have to know, because you can assert that all the drugs are going to work exactly the same, and we've done a lot of research showing that generic drugs work exactly the same as each other and work exactly the same as the brand name drug that they're interchanged with. So that kind of shopping process shouldn't need to be done.
Yeah, let me just mention that this paper is about the price that goes to the manufacturers. Now, there are issues in different, what happens in the distribution afterwards, which is going to be the subject of a conference here on June 14th. Next question. Sure, Richard.
I presume you're a physician?
Yes.
I was always told by my doctor that you do diagnosis before therapy. You said two things that were quite interesting at the beginning, which is you talked about the importance of shortages as leading to price increases, and you talked about, dramatic price increases, quite unlike anything we see in ordinary areas of the economy. Could you say a little bit more about the reason that we get these shortages? We don't get shortages of Drano. We don't get shortages of almost any of these other things that are made with chemicals, so on and so forth. I presume that most of your shortages come when there are zero competitors or one competitor. It's kind of hard to orchestrate a shortage if there are a lot of people providing. And once you do that diagnosis, do you think of anything other than, well, let's import from overseas, or let's import from north of the border?
Sure. I'm happy to start answering that question, and then I'll let Tom take over as well. So I think that there are a number of reasons why shortages occur, and they may occur because of a disruption in the origins of the chemicals that go into making the product. It may be that there's an enforcement action that the FDA brings against a substandard manufacturer, closes the manufacturer. Shortages can occur because a company decides that they don't want to produce the drug anymore. There are other more profitable ways that they can use their pill press machine, and so they leave the market, and they're the one or the only two or the only one manufacturer making it. So there are a number of different reasons why shortages might occur. And I think that in the normal course of the market, the prices will go up based on the remaining competitors if there are any left. And other manufacturers then should be brought in, but I think that the problem is that can be challenged by the need to engage in the new the new testing that is needed to occur, if mergers and consolidations are such that there aren't any manufacturers that want to enter. And so we envision this as a potential solution to that issue, particularly if there are manufacturers that have gone through the approval process in other similarly strong countries, similarly strong regulatory system countries, this would be a short, sort of an efficient fix to that issue, while the market sort of rights itself.
Yeah, so I'll just add a couple things. I mean, the first thing, Aaron quite rightly laid out the reasons for shortage, but probably the deeper question is, why do you have so few manufacturers making older generics, which is really the precursor to getting shortages, because you only have one supplier or two suppliers on the market, and that's because, by and large, the great profits are to be made early in the generic cycle. And for smaller sized markets, older generic drugs, you tend to have fewer competitors. And then if you have a disruption in your pharmaceutical ingredients or a uptick in FDA inspections, this happened with sterile injectables in 2010, you can see shortages happen because there's not many suppliers. And as Aaron quite rightly mentioned, the supply tends to be inelastic. And that not only do you have to get your drug approved, you also have to build the manufacturing capacity for that. And this is why importation is useful, because these entities have already built the manufacturing capacity for it. They may need to build additional to supply the U.S. market, but at least they're on that road, and it's more of a question of expanding something that exists, or maybe they can even do it with their current capacity. That's the big benefit. The other thing to understand about importation, we import now. The U.S. is the largest importer of finished pharmaceuticals in the world. Most of 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredient is imported. This is not a new idea. What really is the new idea here is leveraging the assessment of another regulatory agency as a way of speeding up the approval process.
Last question, Louise.
Yeah. So I wonder if you've thought about, I think you have thought about it, what the implications might be if we had this system in place in terms of how many manufacturers might there then be, right? So you're talking about there's not many incentives, a lot of competition. Would we think that maybe we would sort of lose the benefits of competition if they would like merge across countries, or some countries would just bow out and leave that one manufacturer in the US or in Canada and then have the same problem?
Yeah, so this is something we've debated a lot and looked at. I mean, I think probably the right analogy to think about, although it's something we're still sorting through, is the trade context, where you have trade barriers decline and suddenly you have new entrants being able to access a market. And what happens there, and normally what you see is, and this is a regulated market, so it would have to still meet standards, but it would go to lower cost production centers over time. And then the question is, are there any political economy reasons why they would still be in multiple places? And you can imagine it gets complicated to predict, which is why we put it as a risk. But I think in terms of getting, particularly for the single window, getting applications sooner, this is a cost-free exercise. This is the way the world is for a lot of other entities moving already, and it's a question of getting the U.S. on board with that.
I want to thank you very much.